Welcome to the Friday, December 26th Wake Up, the final wake up of 2025. Thank you for spending the year with us. Now let's have a great 2026 together. Our topic this week is a call for fair access. Conservatives seek equal space to be heard.
Part 1. The moral question of fair access. It is no secret in today's America that liberals and Democrats often enjoy broader access to both public and private spaces than conservatives and Republicans. Across the country, there is an ongoing struggle for conservatives to obtain fair and equal access to venues that are supposedly open to everyone. This denial is most visible on university campuses, where conservative speakers and student groups frequently face administrative roadblocks, restrictive policies, or outright rejection. However, universities are not the only battleground. This exclusion extends into high schools, community centers, libraries, and publicly funded venues, where free expression should be protected regardless of ideology. In many of these shared spaces, liberals, Democrats, and allied organizations, particularly activist groups aligned with progressive causes, are often given free rein to assemble, speak, and promote their ideas without resistance. When conservatives and Republicans attempt to use the same spaces under the same rules, they are frequently denied permits, subjected to additional scrutiny, or met with organized hostility. As a result, legal battles have emerged across the nation as conservatives seek nothing more than equal access to spaces that already exist for others. What should be an even playing field has become one tilted heavily in one ideological direction. From a faith-based perspective, this imbalance raises serious concerns. Scripture consistently affirms the dignity of truth, the value of honest dialogue, and the necessity of justice without partiality. Proverbs 18 verse 17 reminds us that the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. In other words, a society that silences one side of a debate robs itself of the refining process through which truth is revealed. When only one worldview is allowed to speak freely, error goes unchallenged and wisdom is diminished. This is not a claim of persecution in a biblical sense, but rather a recognition of a documented pattern of unequal access. Organizations, such as the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, have published surveys and reports showing consistent imbalances on college campuses. Conservative students and speakers report higher rates of obstruction, denial, and hostile treatment. We have all seen the videos: tables flipped, drinks thrown, shouted threats, and events shut down, not in secret but in plain view. Thankfully, in today's world, there always seems to be a camera nearby. These incidents are often captured and shared, exposing behavior that would otherwise be dismissed or denied. Yet despite the evidence, the pattern continues. Isaiah 5 verse 20 warns of societies that call evil good and good evil. Conservative Christians increasingly find themselves defending not only political positions, but deeply held convictions about life, family, faith, and freedom. These beliefs are not new, radical, or dangerous, yet they are treated as unwelcome or unacceptable in spaces funded and maintained for the public. This is not an argument for dominance or the silencing of others. It is a call for fairness, humility, and the preservation of basic constitutional rights. A healthy democracy, like a healthy church, makes room for disagreement. When access to public and private spaces becomes contingent upon ideology, both democratic principles and biblical values are undermined, and ultimately, everyone loses. Part 2. The rise of progressive-dominated cultural and institutional spaces. Over the past several decades, liberal and progressive ideologies have become firmly entrenched within many of America's most influential institutions. What was once a diverse marketplace of ideas has increasingly narrowed into a dominant ideological current. Universities, in particular, stand as a clear example. Institutions that were historically dedicated to rigorous debate and intellectual challenge now reflect overwhelming political imbalance. Numerous studies have shown that faculty at major universities lean heavily Democratic, often by margins exceeding 10-to-1 within the humanities and social sciences. This concentration does more than shape personal opinions. It directly influences curriculum design, classroom discussion, campus culture, and administrative decision-making. When only one ideological framework is consistently affirmed, dissenting viewpoints are not simply debated, they are marginalized. Conservative students frequently report self-censorship, not because they lack ideas, but because they fear academic penalty or social isolation. A learning environment built on conformity rather than inquiry undermines the very purpose of higher education. The result is a generation of students taught what to think rather than how to think. The media and entertainment industries reflect a similar imbalance. Major news organizations, television networks, film studios, and digital platforms are largely staffed by individuals who openly identify as progressive. This ideological uniformity shapes editorial endorsements, story selection, and the framing of public issues. While advocacy journalism has existed throughout history, the near absence of ideological counterbalance has created an environment where conservative perspectives are routinely portrayed as extreme, outdated, or morally suspect. Many conservatives feel they are no longer participants in the national conversation, but subjects of ridicule or dismissal. This imbalance extends beyond messaging into cultural influence. Entertainment increasingly reflects one moral vision, often disconnected from the values held by millions of Americans rooted in faith, family, and tradition. Rather than reflecting the diversity of the nation, these industries often project a narrow cultural narrative as if it were universal truth. Corporate America has not remained immune. In recent years, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have become deeply embedded within corporate structures. While these initiatives often emphasize racial and gender inclusion, they frequently overlook or actively exclude political and religious diversity. Employees who express traditional beliefs about marriage, gender, or faith have, in some cases, faced reprimands, termination, or forced re-education. These views, once considered mainstream and broadly acceptable, now place individuals at professional risk. From a faith-based perspective, the concern is not that progressives hold influence. Influence itself is not sinful, nor is disagreement. The concern arises when influence hardens into exclusion. Scripture consistently warns against systems that elevate one worldview while silencing others. Ecclesiastes reminds us that wisdom is found in humility and discernment, not in enforced uniformity or ideological pride. A society that refuses to listen closes itself off from correction and truth. The problem is compounded when institutions publicly claim neutrality or inclusivity while operating with clear ideological bias. Conservatives are often told they are welcome, as long as they leave their convictions at the door. This conditional acceptance is not true inclusion. It is quiet erasure. It demands silence rather than dialogue and compliance rather than coexistence. Such an approach contradicts democratic ideals, which depend on open disagreement, and Christian teachings, which emphasize honesty, courage, and the dignity of conscience. A culture that values appearance over truth may maintain temporary harmony, but it sacrifices integrity. If America is to remain both free and faithful to its founding principles, it must reclaim the courage to allow competing ideas to be heard, without fear, favoritism, or exclusion. Part 3. Conservatives, Republicans, and the reality of exclusion. The exclusion of conservatives and Republicans is not hypothetical, nor is it rooted in mere perception or political grievance. It is measurable, documented, and increasingly observable across America's most influential institutions. On college campuses in particular, conservative speakers are disproportionately targeted for protest, disruption, or outright disinvitation. Events that proceed peacefully when featuring progressive voices often encounter extraordinary resistance when conservative viewpoints are involved. This pattern has become so common that it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The foundation for individual rights and expression, FIRE, a nonpartisan organization committed to defending civil liberties, has documented hundreds of incidents in which conservative events were canceled, delayed, or obstructed. These cancellations are frequently justified by vague claims of harm, safety concerns, or community impact, even when no credible threat exists. Rather than upholding the principles of free expression, institutions increasingly prioritize avoiding controversy over protecting constitutional rights. These incidents follow a consistent and troubling pattern. University administrators routinely cite ambiguous concerns while ignoring their obligation to safeguard lawful speech. Instead of enforcing rules against those who disrupt events or intimidate speakers, institutions often choose the path of least resistance by canceling the event altogether. This approach effectively rewards disruption and punishes peaceful participation. The message is unmistakable. Speech will be restricted not because it is unlawful, but because it is unpopular with those who hold institutional authority. Student organizations face similar discrimination. Conservative student groups regularly report heightened administrative scrutiny, prolonged funding delays, and excessive policy hurdles that are not imposed on their progressive counterparts. Requirements are altered mid-process, approvals are stalled without explanation, and access to campus facilities is limited or denied. In many cases, courts have ruled in favor of these organizations, affirming that such unequal treatment violates First Amendment protections. Yet despite repeated legal decisions, the behavior continues, suggesting that the issue is cultural and ideological, not procedural. The problem extends beyond physical campuses into the digital world. Online platforms now function as modern public squares, shaping discourse, visibility, and public engagement. Exclusion in these spaces carries serious consequences. While content moderation is necessary to prevent genuine harm, enforcement has been anything but neutral. Internal documents, whistleblower testimony, and congressional hearings have revealed that conservative political and religious content is more likely to be flagged, downranked, or labeled as misinformation, even when it is factually accurate. This selective enforcement quietly limits reach and influence, effectively silencing voices without formally banning them. From a Christian perspective, this moment echoes a familiar theme. Beliefs rooted in biblical morality increasingly clash with prevailing cultural norms. Scripture reminds believers that truth will not always be welcomed and that standing firm often carries social and personal costs. However, it is critical to clarify what is being asked. Conservative Republicans are not seeking special privileges, dominance, or immunity from criticism. They're not demanding that others be silenced. They are asking for parity, the same access to platforms, spaces, and dialogue that liberals already enjoy. Disagreement is not discrimination. Debate is not danger. A healthy society does not fear differing viewpoints. It relies on them. When access is denied, speech is suppressed, and bias becomes normalized, a moral line is crossed. Free expression cannot survive if it is conditional upon ideological alignment. A society confident in its values should invite open debate, trusting that truth can withstand scrutiny. History shows that freedom, once restricted for one group, rarely remains restricted for only one. If fairness is abandoned now, the cost will ultimately be borne by all. Part 4. Consequences for free speech and democratic health. When conservative voices are excluded, the damage extends far beyond any single political group. Free speech, one of the foundational pillars of American democracy, depends not on agreement, but on viewpoint neutrality. The Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed that the First Amendment exists precisely to protect unpopular, dissenting, or minority viewpoints. Speech that is comfortable or widely accepted does not require constitutional protection. It is speech that challenges prevailing opinion that the First Amendment was designed to safeguard. Throughout American history, courts have emphasized that government institutions, particularly public universities and publicly funded venues, may not discriminate against speech based on ideology. This principle exists because once viewpoint discrimination becomes acceptable, the door opens to arbitrary power. What is silence today under the justification of harm or offense may tomorrow include entirely different beliefs. Free speech, by its nature, must apply evenly or it ceases to exist at all. Faith traditions reinforce this understanding. Scripture consistently emphasizes accountability, discernment, and truth-seeking through dialogue rather than suppression. Even within the early church, disagreement was not avoided or silenced. Acts 15 records a significant theological dispute among early believers, one that could have fractured the church. Instead of enforcing silence or authority by decree, the leaders engaged in rigorous debate, careful listening, and reasoned discussion. Truth was clarified through engagement, not coercion. That example stands in sharp contrast to modern institutions that treat disagreement as a threat rather than an opportunity for refinement. When ideological diversity erodes, institutions inevitably weaken. Echo chambers form, reinforcing assumptions rather than testing them. Ideas go unchallenged, errors multiply, and intellectual rigor declines. Studies of organizational behavior consistently show that environments lacking viewpoint diversity are more prone to groupthink, poor decision-making, and declining credibility. This is not a conservative problem or a liberal one. It is a human problem rooted in the fear of dissent. The consequences are visible in public life. When conservatives feel unheard or unwelcome, disengagement often follows. People withdraw from institutions they no longer trust, whether universities, media, or civic organizations. This withdrawal does not produce unity. It produces polarization. Rather than fostering reconciliation or mutual understanding, exclusion hardens divisions and deepens resentment. A society that silences disagreement does not eliminate conflict. It drives it underground, where it grows more volatile. Democracy ultimately requires moral courage, the courage to allow opposing views the space to exist, even when they challenge deeply held beliefs. This courage is not passive tolerance, but active commitment to fairness and integrity. Without it, democratic systems become hollow rituals, elections without trust, debates without honesty, and institutions without legitimacy. A free society is not measured by how well it protects popular speech, but by how faithfully it preserves room for dissent. When conservative voices are excluded, the loss is shared by everyone. Truth suffers, institutions decay, and the moral foundation of democracy is weakened. If freedom of speech is to endure, it must be defended not only when it is easy, but when it is inconvenient. Part 5. Double standards and the misuse of tolerance. One of the most troubling aspects of modern exclusion is the selective application of tolerance. Progressive spaces frequently proclaim a commitment to diversity, inclusion, and openness. These values are celebrated publicly and embedded into institutional language, mission statements, and policies. Yet this commitment often ends when diversity includes traditional religious beliefs or conservative convictions. At that point, tolerance gives way to exclusion, and inclusion becomes conditional upon ideological agreement. Conservatives are increasingly labeled as dangerous, bigoted, or harmful, not because they advocate violence or lawlessness, but because they hold views consistent with long-standing religious doctrine or traditional constitutional interpretation. Positions on marriage, gender, life, and religious liberty, beliefs that were widely accepted in American society for generations, are now treated as moral transgressions. This labeling is not merely rhetorical. It is used to justify denying conservatives access to shared spaces, platforms, and institutional participation. At the same time, progressive activism is often encouraged, funded, and protected under the banner of expression and social justice. Protests, demonstrations, and ideological advocacy aligned with progressive causes are framed as courageous or necessary, even when disruptive. The double standard is difficult to ignore. One worldview is afforded moral legitimacy and institutional protection, while the other is treated as inherently suspect or threatening. From a Christian perspective, This selective tolerance represents a distortion of justice. Scripture consistently affirms that God's standard is impartiality. James 2 explicitly warns against showing favoritism, reminding believers that unequal treatment is not merely unfair, but morally wrong. Justice, according to biblical teaching, is not determined by popularity, power, or cultural approval. It is grounded in truth and applied evenly, regardless of who holds the belief. When institutions abandon impartiality, they undermine both moral and civic foundations. Justice that favors one group while condemning another ceases to be justice at all. In its place arises a system driven by ideology rather than principle. This erosion damages trust and weakens the legitimacy of institutions that claim moral authority while practicing exclusion. When tolerance becomes conditional, it loses its meaning. True tolerance does not require agreement. It requires restraint and fairness in the face of disagreement. A society that only tolerates approved viewpoints is not tolerant. It is enforcing conformity. Ideological enforcement may achieve surface-level harmony, but it does so at the cost of honesty, freedom, and moral integrity. History repeatedly shows that systems built on enforced orthodoxy eventually turn inward, narrowing further and punishing even minor dissent. What begins as exclusion of conservatives will not end there. Standards will continue to shift, and new lines will be drawn. A free and faithful society must resist this pattern. It must recover a vision of tolerance rooted in principle rather than politics. Without impartiality, diversity becomes a slogan rather than a practice, and justice becomes a tool of power rather than a moral guide. Part 6. A call for restoration and shared space. The path forward is not domination, retaliation, or withdrawal from public life. It is restoration. Conservatives and Republicans are not calling for exclusive control of institutions, nor are they seeking to silence opposing views. They are calling for shared space, physical, cultural, and digital, where ideas can be debated openly without fear of exclusion, punishment, or institutional bias. Restoration means returning to principles that once governed American civic life: fairness, neutrality, and respect for conscience. Faith teaches that light does not fear darkness, and truth does not fear scrutiny. Throughout Scripture, truth is tested, challenged, and refined, not hidden or enforced through silence. A society that is confident in its values does not shut down dissenting voices. It allows them to speak, trusting that truth can withstand examination. When institutions suppress speech out of fear, they reveal not strength, but insecurity. America's strength has always rested in its ability to hold tension between differing views. Our constitutional system was designed with disagreement in mind, not unanimity. The First Amendment does not exist to protect consensus. It exists to protect conflict handled peacefully and lawfully. Restoring that balance is not merely a political necessity. It is a moral imperative. Without it, freedom becomes conditional and justice becomes selective. Thankfully, there are signs of positive change. In Tennessee, state leaders have announced an official partnership with Turning Point USA's Club America program to bring chapters into high schools across the state. The goal is to allow student-led groups that promote conservative principles to be launched or supported at every Tennessee high school. The announcement, made by lawmakers including Senator Jack Johnson and Senator Marsha Blackburn, reflects a growing recognition that conservative students deserve the same opportunities for organization and expression as their progressive peers. While some local districts have stated that they are still awaiting guidance on implementation, the intent is clear. Access should not be denied based on ideology. Texas has taken an even more assertive approach. State officials, including Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, have launched a similar initiative in partnership with Turning Point USA with the stated goal of establishing Club America chapters in every high school across the state. Texas leaders have publicly warned schools not to block the formation of these clubs and have instructed that any obstruction be reported to the Texas Education Agency. This effort mirrors Tennessee's initiative, but includes a stronger directive that schools actively allow or support equal access. The message from Texas leadership is unmistakable. Ideological discrimination has no place in public education. These efforts matter not because they favor conservatism, but because they restore fairness. They signal that conservative students are no longer expected to remain silent while others organize freely. They affirm that constitutional rights do not disappear at the schoolhouse gate. However, this moment should not lead to complacency. Progress can be reversed as quickly as it is achieved. We must not become content simply because the political climate feels more favorable or because a sense of normalcy appears to be returning under the Trump administration's leadership. Rights that are not actively defended have a way of eroding quietly. If conservatives grow comfortable and disengaged, the consequences will come swiftly. The year 2028 is closer than it seems. Cultural momentum does not pause, and institutions do not reform themselves permanently. If this fight for fairness, free speech, and constitutional integrity is abandoned now, the gains made will be short-lived. Let us continue to stand for equal access, moral courage, and principled engagement. Restoration requires vigilance, humility, and persistence. The path forward has been outlined by states willing to act. It is now up to the rest of the nation to follow, not for political victory alone, but for the preservation of freedom itself.
Thank you for listening and reflecting with us. If you'd like, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and join us again next Friday for our next Friday Wake Up.